Hello. Hello, my name's Adela and I make minis. Back in April, I challenged myself to make 100 tiny vases in 100 days. And this is days 1 through 50. Enjoy! So every mini vase that I make starts with a blob of clay, and it's usually just the size of a thimble. I begin the process with the body, which is the biggest part of each vase, and I usually start with the bottom half. Because everything's so small, I tend to use tools more than I use my fingers, because my fingers are pretty chunky. So here I'm using the end of a paintbrush to open up the clay to allow space for my finger to then go in and pinch the rest of the way out. And I'll do this with both the top and the bottom. Once I've got my two halves, I'll join it with a tiny little sausage of clay. This makes sure that the join is strong, because even though they're small, they've still got to be functional, and they're going to go through a lot of stress in the kiln, and I have to make sure that every single join and seam isn't going to blow open. Next up is the neck, which similarly to the body, I will join with another sausage, just to make sure. I then move on to the rim, which I like to just pinch open slowly. And then the fiddliest part of the whole process, handles. They're small, they dry out super quickly, so you always need to work a little bit faster than you have been. Generally, these tiny pieces dry out a lot faster than larger pieces. Usually if you're working on a huge piece, you can leave it, cover it up, it'll stay wet for, weeks at a time if you store it properly. These little boys, not so much. Usually by the end of the hour, they'll be hard enough to start scraping back. We call that leather hard in ceramics. And this means that if you squeeze it, it won't, instantly collapse on itself. I did add a fancy little foot on this guy, but in the end I decided he didn't need it. Sometimes simpler is better. Day 2 starts just the same as day 1. We begin with the body. A similar shape to yesterday, but it doesn't mean that it will ultimately end up looking the same. Once the two halves are joined, you've essentially sealed air into that shape, which means that you can apply a bit more pressure than usual and the shape won't collapse. I like to pat the shape down with my wooden tool and then finalise it by scraping it back with a metal rib, which gets things really nice and smooth. When I first started, a lot of my pieces were lumpy because I was too scared to press down, but these little guys are pretty tough and they can withstand quite a bit of manhandling. So once the neck is on, it's time to do the rim. Now, sometimes the rim will crack when I pinch it open, and this is mainly to do with the fact that the clay's dried out quite a bit and it's not flexible enough to open out. But the nice thing about clay is that you can always re-wet it, add some more clay, and Bob's your uncle, good as new. Now, yesterday's fancy foot didn't quite work out, so I thought I'd try again with this one. A thimble is usually a really good size for these feet. And the final and fiddliest step, as always, are the handles. I did think about adding a little face to this guy, but in the end I opted for some black slip, which I'm then going to cover with a transparent glaze later on. And it's going to come out looking a little bit like a pebble or a rock. You get some nice blacks from the slip, but then the glaze brings out some blues and some whites, and it's just milky and mottled and really, really lovely. And there he is. Day 2, another cutie. So for day 3, I decided to go for a much narrower bottom. I usually achieve this by rolling the clay whilst it's on the paintbrush, and that way you get a nice tapered edge. So once I've got the body looking exactly how I want it, I'm going to move on to the neck. And the neck is probably the simplest and most straightforward part of the whole thing. I'll roll out a little tiny slab of clay, and then I'll wet the edges, place it on the body, make sure I've got it exactly where I want it. Sometimes you need to turn it around, see it from all angles and shift it about. But once it's there, I'll tack it down and add my sausage just to make sure that that join is good. Now, sometimes when you add a sausage, because you're adding extra clay, you can make that part of the pot much chunkier than you want it. And that part is called the shoulder, where the neck and the body meet. And sometimes you need to get in there and push that clay back down and reshape it. I usually do this, again, with my trusty paintbrush, just to sort of really get in there and get a nice sharp line. This was yet another one where the rim cracked. The clay that I'm working with this week has been either way too soft or just way too hard. So it's been a little bit of a juggling act. But as always, you can just patch that right up and no one would ever know. So I'm back home and I've got a new sexy angle, and I'm hoping that this will let you see a little bit more detail. So the guy I'm making today is going to be much smaller and much squatter. So once I've joined together my body and my neck and pinched out my rim, I'm going to move on to the handles. Now, depending on the shape of your handles, you don't always have to add a sausage, but I quite like the shape that the sausage gives to the handles. It makes it look like the handles are growing out of the body rather than just stuck on. And here you can see one side I've added sausages and the other one hasn't, and there is a little bit of a difference. And that's all personal preference. I just think it looks cuter like this. So once we've got the basic shape down, it's time to think about how is this little guy going to stand up. Now sometimes you'll see me tapping down onto the table for some of these, and that's just to level out the bottom so it can stand up on its own. But sometimes I feel like it needs a little foot, and this is one of those. This time I opted for something pretty simple, just because I liked the shape that it gave you overall. But one thing I have learnt the hard way is that whether you're having a foot or not, you are going to have to make the bottom concave, because that's what's going to give it that stability. The larger the area that's on the bottom, the more likely you are to have a wobbly pot. When I first started, probably 99% of my minis were wobbly. On my larger pieces, I usually just smack the bottom with a spoon and then that gives you a nice little shape. But for these guys, I like to opt for either the back of the brush or even the top of a pencil, whatever's the best shape. Sometimes social media is a good thing, and on day 6 I saw a new ceramicist on Instagram that was working with inlay, and I was absolutely in love with this technique and I thought I need to try it. I'd never done it before, so I was excited to see whether it would work or not. So once I'd worked the body first, which today was weirdly lumpy, I haven't made a lumpy one like this in a while. So once that lumpy body was done, I then incised the pattern. I scratched the pattern in with a blunt pencil. Once I was happy with that and got all the fluffy bits out the way and cleaned it up, I then started filling those gaps with coloured slip. I went for black for this one because I'm hoping that it will pop once it's fired. And you do that maybe 1 or 2, 3 layers, just whenever you feel that that's filled in. And then the scary part, scratching away all of the layers that you've just built up so that you get a nice smooth surface, and hopefully where you've made that gap, you've now got a colour. I was a little bit scared that I might scratch too deep and then lose the pattern, but thankfully it came out looking pretty good. It was a little bit smudgy and I probably could have done a better job, but I was just too scared of going too deep, aren't we all? I'm excited to see how this one turns out once it's been through the kiln. Maybe he'll be even cuter, maybe he won't. So today I decided to play with opposites. Here I've gone for a really wide body, and I thought wide body and then a really long skinny neck. So here I'm rolling it out, joining together and then seeing how it's going to look. I think this one is a little bit too long, but we're going to join it first and see. As amazing as new shapes are, they can start to pose some problems, and mainly those problems are being able to see. This one was really hard to cut out the opening because the neck was so narrow. I had to really get in there with a torch and a needle, and I was quite scared I was going to lose that lump that I was cutting out and it was going to drop to the bottom, but thankfully I managed to fish it out. The smaller you go, the more problems happen, but I think it ended up being worth it. I did trim it down a little bit because I thought it was a bit too long, and then pinching out the rim, just a tiny one this time, and then adding the final touch, which as always are the handles. I like to start with the body because it's the largest part of the vase, and for the most part it gives you the direction that the vase is going to go in. I make it in 2 halves. I start with the bottom usually, I pinch it out, and then I move on to the top half. I like to use my paintbrush to just open things out, get things started, because these are really small and my fingers can't quite fit into the clay. And one thing you do have to be quite mindful about is matching the width of the top to the bottom half of the body that you've already made. So you're not only focusing on how is this shape going to look when it's finished, but you're also having to focus on where is this going to join up and how is it going to join up. So speaking of joins, I like to reinforce where the 2 halves meet with a tiny little sausage of clay. And I do this just to make sure that the join is really strong, because the piece is going to be under a lot of stress when it's in the kiln. There's a lot of heat in there and you don't want it to blow open at the seams, because the seams are always going to be your most vulnerable points. Now, occasionally the sausage that I add is flat, it's not rounded, and this is because you don't always want to add extra bulk, because you're adding clay. You don't want to add extra bulk to the shape. So I like to pre-flatten it and then add it on. So once we've got the final shape of the body, we're then moving on to the foot. So today, first day, I decided I'd try and hit one of my goals, and that's to make a fancy little foot. Now there's lots of different ways you can make this, but I've realised that using a thimble is generally the perfect size. So the first thing I do is I roll out a small slab of clay, then I lay the thimble over that and then cut around, and that gives me a nearly perfect circle. And then it's just a case of building up from there. So I wanted this to look a little bit like a pedestal, so it's got a tapered edge and then it, grows out. I don't know how to describe it, but it's going to look nice. Once I've joined my smaller blob of clay onto that little disc, it's then a case of blending it out and attaching it to the body. And once I've got that looking good, I'll move on to the neck, trim it down a little bit and pinch out a rim. Sometimes pieces will be a little bit lumpy, they'll sit in that what I call ugly stage for quite a while. But I've learned that it pays to just work through that ugly stage, because more often than not, they do end up looking really nice at the end, especially once you've added handles. Occasionally, yeah, the hard work won't pay off, but this time I think it did. So when I start making a piece, I don't always have a plan. Sometimes I've just got a vague idea or a notion. Sometimes I totally wing it. Very, very occasionally I'll have a really specific shape that I want to make in mind. Today I just had one word, and that was wide. So that's where we're starting from. I'm not sure if I managed it, but let's wait and see. So once the body's all joined up, I can actually be a little bit rougher with the shape than I usually would. And that's because there's trapped air in there, and that's going to act as cushioning. So this is a perfect moment to refine the shape. You'll see me rolling it out on the table, or patting it down with my wooden tool, or even just giving it a little squeeze just to finalise the shape. So once I'm happy with the final shape, I'll then roll out a small neck and join it on. Today I decided to trim quite a lot off the neck. When I first started, I would make the neck the finished size and then attach it, and more often than not I wasn't happy with how it looked. So these days I give myself a little bit more leeway. So once that's all pinched out, it's then time to cut out an opening. It's really satisfying just sort of gouging it out in one piece. I do worry occasionally that that little blob is going to drop down to the bottom. It's not the end of the world, but I just would really hate knowing that there was a messy little blob of clay in the bottom of these vases. What can I say, I'm a perfectionist. So for this piece, I thought, okay, day 2, let's try the other goal. Let's go for inlay again. So inlay is quite a simple technique. All you do is you gouge out a pattern with a blunt pencil or any blunt instrument, and then once you're happy with the pattern, you add some coloured slip, so that's liquid clay. Today I went with white, which I'm hoping will pop. And you've got to do a few layers of this just so you fill out that gap that you've made. And once that's dried a little bit, you then start scratching away that excess slip until you reveal the pattern beneath. This was the second time that I've ever done this, and I actually don't think I did any better. I think I did worse. I was a bit too confident when I was scratching away. I'm still learning how far to go with that. And I definitely scratched out some of the pattern. But I don't know, I'm excited to keep practicing and get better with it so that I can really start experimenting and getting some good results. But this guy, he's alright. You know what? They can't all be amazing. So for this one, I wanted a really tapered, narrow bottom. To make these tapered shapes, I usually find it easiest to put my lump of clay on the back end of my paintbrush. And once I've got that, I'll just roll it and then you get a really lovely taper. So once I have that initial cone shape, I then widen it a little bit, make my top half. This time I actually had a lot of extra clay to blend the two halves together. So for once, I actually didn't need a sausage. We're then moving on to the neck, which I had a little bit of an issue with this time around. Once I'd attached it fully, I noticed that there was a tiny little gap. So I just had to add a little extra clay in there so I didn't have a hole. So once the rim is pinched out, I then cut out the opening and move on to the foot, which this one I decided just needed a little something to help it balance and stay standing. So once I was happy with how the foot looked, I then moved on to the handles, and then disaster struck. Well, only a little one. These guys are pretty hardy and most of the damage can be repaired because the clay is still really soft, so you can just go back in there and reshape stuff. There were a few dents that I decided to leave, purely because I feel like it gives the piece a little bit more of a story, that it's got some history already even though it's brand new. And then I decided to paint this one black. And my plan is to glaze this with a translucent glaze and it will come out looking really mottled. There'll be shades of black from the slip, but then also blues and whites. It'll look really, really lovely, just like a little pebble. So yeah, that's this guy done. And yeah, tall, dark and handsome. One thing I have noticed is that the better I get at making these minis, the smaller they become, which is great, but I do start to worry that they'll lose their function and you won't actually be able to put flowers in them, which is why I make them. I want my pieces to be functional and not just decorative. They're not knickknacks that you put on a shelf. They're pieces that you should be able to use every single day. Another problem is that yes, they're getting smaller now, but once they go through the kiln, they'll get even smaller because these pieces shrink. I will also drop in that all of these pieces will be available on my website once they're done. Just keep an eye out for updates. Now, as you'll see, I've moved on to the neck and I'm adding more than one spout. And this is because I went a little bit rogue today. I'd seen some tulipiers online and I thought I would have a go at making my own tulipier inspired vase. Tulipiers were a big fad in the 17th century and they were made so that you could grow tulips inside. So these weren't vases in the way that we'd think now for cut flowers. These were vases that would have the actual bulb inside. Mine won't be like that, it will just be for cut flowers, dried flowers, but I was intrigued by these spouts, so we'll see. We'll see how it comes out. I started off with 3 initially, but I felt that it was a little bit unbalanced, so I needed to add the 4th. The 4th did end up being a little bit of a nightmare to match. The first one was too narrow, the second one I ripped a hole through the side, but it was fine. In the end, we were fine, and yeah, it's a little bit of a weird one today. I can't wait to see what it's going to look like with flowers, because I think that's actually what's going to make it. Day 12 was a little bit of a slug day. I'd spent the whole morning playing Botany Manor, which is a great game if you like flowers and puzzles. But I did see a really nice pot. So I thought, okay, that's what I'm going to do today. I'm going to try and be inspired by this pot and recreate it / make something akin to this shape. So once I'd joined up my 2 halves of the body, I then set about finalising the shape. So this vase had some straight edges, so I decided the easiest way to do that would be to roll the body, and that gives you a flat, sharp edge. And then it was a case of patting it down with my wooden tool. Again, once the 2 halves are joined, this is a great time to start manipulating the shape. However, there is a limit, because there's trapped air in there. There is a limit as to how much pressure that clay can hold. And this one, I was definitely pushing it. I could feel that there was a lot of pressure in that tiny little body, and the clay did start to crack. I extended the bottom, I added a tiny little foot, and then it was on to the neck. So this piece has got a much wider neck than you'd initially think, and I actually think I could have gone even wider with this one, but it looks balanced. And so once I'd pinched out the rim, I decided to move on to the handles. And these were maybe the smallest handles I've done in a really, really long time. So they were super fiddly, but very cute. I decided to be quite ambitious on day 13 actually. We kick things off, as always, with making the body. Today is a great example of how differently you have to treat the clay at different stages. The edges of my halves today were a little bit cracked, so I had a lot of holes when I was initially joining them. At this stage, I had to be really, really gentle because too much pressure and I would collapse the shape. So because of the gaps, I decided to add an extra wide sausage of clay to seal everything up. And then once that was all airtight, then I could go in and again apply much more pressure to the piece and shape it how I want it to look. So once I was happy with the body, I moved on to the neck. The initial one that I rolled out today actually felt too small. It didn't balance out the shape overall. So I scrapped that one and decided to go even wider. When joining the neck, again I had to be really gentle because the clay was so soft. So once I'd pinched out the rim, I decided to move on to the foot. And today's was another fancy foot. This time I made it out of 3 tiers. So again, I'm using my thimble as a template, and I wanted it to be quite a chunky bottom, so I stacked 2 little discs of clay together, and then I added a smaller blob on top. And once it was looking roughly how I wanted it to, I joined it to the bottom, added some more clay to make it all secure, shaped it again, and yeah, looks pretty nice. Then I moved on to the handles, and for this piece I decided to bring in some texture, and so I've added some fluting to the bottom half. I did later on decide that it still needed a bit more, so I extended those lines all the way down to the bottom of the foot. I'm really, really pleased with this one. He looks amazing, like a proper little vase. Day 14 was a very late session and I was very tired. So because I was so tired, I just wanted it to be over really quickly. When I started this challenge, I definitely expected there to be good days and bad days, and this was maybe not the best day. So because of that, I was working very instinctually and very quickly. I wasn't being my usual perfectionist self, so stuff that would usually bother me didn't bother me today. So I went for quite a simple shape for the body, a nice little short neck with a wide rim. And once I'd cut out the opening and added my little handles, I decided to paint this little guy with some white slip. And again, I was working quite quickly, and I'm hoping that once this is fired, you'll actually be able to see the little brush strokes on there. And then to top it off, just a little face to reflect my feelings. But he's very, very cute. I do love him very much. What do you think? Let me know in the comments. So for day 15, I actually had a plan, but I totally forgot about it and went on a bit of a mad one. To kick things off, we'll begin with the body, as always. I make these in 2 halves, usually starting with the bottom and then moving on to the top. This one had some holes when I was joining the 2 halves, so I had to be really careful and gentle with it. But once it's airtight, I can be a bit firmer and continue to make the final shape. Next, I moved on to the neck, and for this one, I decided to go for a really thin neck, so I had to be super careful. Last time I made such a thin neck, I had loads of trouble cutting out the opening. So this time, I had the cunning idea to cut out the opening before adding the neck, and that ended up working a treat. So once the neck is on, I trim it down just a little bit, and then I move on to the handles. For this one, I decided to go for nice chunky handles to balance out the thin neck. And next we're on to the foot, and for this one I just went for a concave bottom, and that reduces the chances of it ending up being a wobbly pot. Once I'd finished this guy, I thought it needed a little bit more decoration. What I like to do usually is take a photo and then draw over the photo, and that gives me a really good, speedy and accurate idea of what it might look like, and I prefer doing it this way rather than spending ages on a drawing because I just want to get ideas out. For this one I couldn't decide between stripes or a nice little face.
He looks like he's got little ears.
Yeah, he does, doesn't he? In the end, I decided to go for the little face. Yeah, alright. You've convinced me. And I think I made the right decision. I really love this guy, he's super cute. Day 16 was another ambitious day. I was quite intrigued by the Tulipier inspired piece that I made last week, so I thought, take 2, let's try again. So once I'd got my body down, I then moved on to the many spouts or necks that this piece is going to have. Last time I made 3 spouts, and then I had a lot of trouble adding a 4th. I couldn't get it to match in shape or size or anything. So this time I decided to make all of the little spouts at once. So once I'd got them made up and added to the body, I added tiny little sausages of clay to the base of each one to give it a really nice smooth shape and a nice transition, and to make sure that the join is nice and strong. I then moved on to pinching out the rim, which ended up being a lot harder this time around because you've got all the other little spouts in the way and you can't quite get your fingers in there properly. I then move on to the foot, and for this one I went for something quite simple. I used my thimble once again to give me a template for the bottom, and then I created a nice thin taper which I attached to the body. When I was done with this one, I didn't think I liked it. I thought that maybe the spouts were too big or that the foot was too small. But once I'd put some tiny little flowers in there, it really came to life, and I think I've changed my mind. So after using all of that brain power yesterday, I decided to have a little bit of a break today and work quite instinctually. I've gone for a really simple body today, and then I've attached my neck, making sure to add my tiny little clay sausage. I then trimmed it down a little bit and moved on to the handles. Today I wanted to play around a little bit with where to place them. I went initially lower down the body with the handles, but then I chickened out and I went closer to where I'd usually put them. I'm not sure why I did that, but I definitely need to start getting better at taking some risks. I then decided that he needs to be zhuzhed up a little bit with some colour or some pattern, but before I did that I realised I hadn't cut out the opening, so I went ahead and did that. So once he was totally finished, I got out my coloured slip, which is just a liquid clay with some colours in, and I went for some really nice, happy, loose stripes. Again, not really thinking about it, just really going for it. I'm super pleased with this tiny guy, and if you like him too, don't worry, because he will be available through my website as soon as he's finished. Today I tried a slightly different shape from the previous days. I ended up going for a tapered body, which was inspired by a really banging ancient vase that I'd seen from Crete. So once I was happy with the shape of the body, I then moved on to the neck. I started off with quite a wide neck, but then I ended up ruining it when I added my clay sausage. I'd lost that nice sharp edge around the shoulder, which is where the neck and the body meet, when I added that extra clay. So I was trying to sculpt that back, but I ended up just narrowing the opening instead. So once I'd got my handles down, I moved on to the foot, which was another fancy foot. I think I'm really getting into them now. And once that was finished and added to the body, I then decided to give the piece some texture. So I went ahead and added some fluting, which I think finishes it off really nicely. I did think that the foot could be a little bit wider to balance out the overall shape, but once again, when I added some tiny flowers, it looked so much better. I think I'm starting to realise that you can't just look at these pieces as they are, but you have to think about what you're going to put in them after they're finished. And whatever that is also going to form part of that final shape. So going forward, I think I'm going to start thinking about how a single stem or a bouquet might affect the shape of the piece. For day 19, I decided to go in a slightly different direction, and I wonder if you can guess what I ended up making today, and let me know in the comments if this one counts. So starting off with the body, I went quite big again, because these shrink a lot when they go through the kiln, because all of the moisture that's in the clay evaporates away, and all you're left with is the stone, essentially. So once I'd got my neck attached, I then moved on to a little pouring spout. I ended up using my paintbrush, and then my other hand was there to support, but it went okay for a first try, but the clay did crack a little bit because it was super thin. I then went for a really nice sturdy handle, and then I moved on to the foot. And for this one, I was really inspired by medieval jugs, and a lot of them have these textured bottoms, which I imagine they did this really quickly with their fingers, just sort of smeared it down. And I love that you can see these maker's marks. It really humanises these pieces and makes them special. You know they were made by someone and not a machine. Sadly, my fingers are way too big to do this on my tiny jug, so in the end I made do with my paintbrush, but I tried to work really quickly and not being too finicky to try and capture that organic feel. I'm quite pleased with how this one turned out. I think I'd definitely like to try some more jugs, but again, does this count as a vase? I'm not sure. You can put flowers in it, so I think it does. Today was a really fun day. I wanted to play with extremes again. So I went for a nice round, large body and then a tall, skinny neck. And once I'd got that attached, I moved on to the foot, which was yet again a fancy foot. And when I was happy with how that was looking, I then moved on to the handles. For this one, I was also really interested in playing with the classical proportions. I decided to put the handles much lower on the body than you'd usually see on this kind of silhouette. And I really love it. The shape is just, amazing. And I'm really getting into these low handles. On day 21, I decided it was pretty late, so let's keep things simple. I went for a really nice, easy shape for the body that I didn't have to refine too much once I joined my two halves together. Then we're moving on to the neck. Once that's on the body, I realised that it was a little bit too soft to move on to the rim, so let's go to the handles while we're waiting for that to firm up. I went for some nice big handles right in the middle of the body, and I think I'll definitely start playing around some more with where these handles end up going. So now that we've had a little bit of time, the clay's firmed up and I can pinch out a rim. And it's looking pretty good, but it looks a little bit naked. I don't think I want to paint this one, so instead I'm going to add a tiny little medallion or stamp that you see a lot on medieval pottery and a lot of fancy flower pots nowadays. This one was actually take 2 because I was so tired that I didn't even realise I wasn't recording the first take. It's a good thing that I actually didn't like that one and I scrapped it in the end. And I'm quite glad that I had a second go because this guy turned out super, super cute and very tiny. On day 22, I was inspired by some Middle Eastern jars from the Bronze Age. I'd seen these in the British Museum and I totally fell in love with their simple silhouette. They just have one smooth curve throughout with no sharp edges or a broken line, and I found it really visually pleasing, so I thought I would make my own but smaller. Once I was happy with how the body was looking, I moved on to the neck, which I joined with a small sausage of clay just to ease that transition from body to neck. Then I pinched out a small lip and moved on to the handles. These looked really great, but they were a nightmare to match up. It's that classic eyeliner situation of the first one's perfect and then the second one is just not happening. But we got there in the end. Once that was finished, I decided that this guy needed some decoration. So I went ahead and got out my white slip. Initially I went for some bold lines, but it wasn't really working. But as I was sponging the slip off, I started to see a cool effect, so I went all in and sponged the slip on instead, and it came out with a super interesting texture. I'm excited to see if this shows up once it's been fired, but you never really know how things are going to come out. I liked the shape from yesterday so much that I decided to carry on with it on day 23. I made the body a little bit larger and a lot more top heavy, which again was inspired by these Bronze Age vases that I'd seen. When I first attached the neck, I worried that it might be a little bit too narrow, but it fleshed out really nicely when I added my clay sausages. Then, once I'd pinched out my lip, I went back in and reshaped the body and the shoulder to be slightly narrower and more sloping, so that you have a really pleasing curve. This also helps to emphasise the top-heavy, rounded shape of the body. So once I'd hollowed out the bottom, I then moved on to the handles. My source image had really small and very low handles. They were well over halfway down the body, so I went ahead and added my own. Once that was all finished, I decided that I want to push the sponging that I did yesterday a little bit further. So this time, along with the white slip, I layered some black slip over the top. And I think it looks great. I'm super excited to see how this one turns out. It looks a little bit like it's been wood fired. Once I'd pinched out the two halves of my body, I went back and I trimmed down the top half as it didn't quite match up and it was a little bit too wide. I then went for a slightly longer neck than the other pieces this week, pinched out a little lip, and moved on to refining my body with my wooden tools and my fingers, just to make sure that everything's lovely and smooth. As I was doing this, I realised that the shape that I'd created reminded me a little bit of a torso with this long neck, and there was something about it that made me feel like this neck should be drooping slightly, like it's too heavy. And I had the image of these little flowers spilling out of the vase, and maybe they're the reason why this neck is so droopy. So I just bent it a little bit. Once I was happy with how that was looking, I moved on to the handles. Now, a good trick that I've learnt to tell if your handles are even is to turn the piece upside down. It gives you a fresh perspective and any differences or unevenness shows up really easily. Then it's on to the decoration. For this one, I went for white slip and some really simple, skinny, horizontal lines. And I think this guy looks great. I can't wait to see him all finished. And if you like him, don't worry, he will be available through my website along with all of the other pieces I'm making during this challenge. Today I wanted to start combining some of the techniques and ideas that I've been using for the previous few days. I had a little bit of a false start with this one. When I first made the body, it felt a little bit too small, so I scrapped it and went bigger. Once I'd refined the shape and was happy with how everything was looking, I moved on to the handles. For this piece, I knew immediately that I wanted to have 4. There's something pleasing about having these different levels on each face of the piece, that no matter which way you turn it, there's always some sort of texture there. Once they were all secured and looking good, I then went ahead and cut out an opening. For this one, I wanted a super short neck, so I tried something new. Instead of making a really tiny cylinder and sticking that on, I instead cut out an opening from the body and pinched up a lip directly from there. As I was finishing this piece up, I felt like it still needed a little bit more embellishment to balance things out. The gaps between the handles just felt a little bit too empty. So I added 4 tiny little stamps or medallions, which you might recognise from last week. I really love how this one turned out. It feels a little bit Mediterranean with these tiny stamps that very much remind me of little tiny seashells. There's something about the shape of the body that I've been playing around with all week that's not only pleasing to the eye, but really pleasing to the touch too. It nestles so nicely in the curves of your palm, partly because it's so small, but also because of this nice gradual curve. So day 26 was no exception, and I carried on with this silhouette. For this one, I decided to go for a tall and thin neck to complement the roundness of the body. Once I'd pinched out my lip and added some handles, I decided to add some texture. I knew I wanted to add some fluting, but I wanted it to be a little bit wider than the fluting I've done previously, which always looks a little bit more Grecian. So for this one, I used my loop tool, which gave me a nice wide stroke. Initially I wanted something really neat and uniform, but I quickly realised because I was trimming it when the clay was still quite wet, I was almost ripping it rather than carving through the clay. But I actually really liked this effect. I think tomorrow I'm going to try and carve the entire piece, not just the bottom half, because this guy looks great, but I'd love to push it further. So, on day 27, I cracked on and made that lovely curved body that I've been making all week. I made the walls slightly thicker this time because I knew I was going to be carving in. Once I was happy with the basic shape, I'd cut out my opening and added a little foot at the bottom. I then got to carving. I decided to follow the contours of the piece and keep everything really rough. I quite enjoyed the unevenness of yesterday's work, so I wanted to push that further. Then it came time to add the handles. I made these super chunky this time because I knew I wanted to carve those too. Smooth handles just looked really weird on this piece. This little vase looks great. I can't wait to glaze this one and see how that glaze reacts to the uneven surface. I'd love to see some colour changes on the ridges or maybe some pooling in the lower areas. I'm super excited, I just can't wait for this one. For day 28, I decided to take a little break from the shape I've been working with all week, and instead I turned it upside down so it was bottom heavy. So once I joined my 2 halves and added my neck, I then trimmed it down a little bit, pinched out my lip, and moved on to the handles. Again, I wanted something different. Initially I went for some Grecian looking handles that you'd see on amphora, but in the end I decided to push the half circle handles that I've been working with all week. They look really fun, but I'm a little bit worried that these might chip off really easily. They're so delicate. For this piece I had to use a thimble to hollow out the bottom as the base was so wide. And then once it was done, I was tempted to finish here, but I thought I'd try some more carving. I started off carving away in the same way I'd been doing for the last 2 vases, but then I thought, why not try something new? So I went for some smaller strokes instead, and it came out with quite an interesting surface. Again, I'm hoping that the glaze will have some cool reactions with this one. I'm not quite sure how I feel about this little vase. He's alright, but I guess when you're making 100 vases, they can't all be winners. I started this week off with another Tulipier inspired shape. I'm a big fan, but I don't feel like I've ever managed to nail it. So, once I've pinched out the 2 halves of my body and joined them together, I begin to make the spouts. I decided to make 3 for this one so that I can make the openings bigger. I then smoothed out the transition from body to neck with some tiny clay sausages and pinched out some tiny lips or rims. At this stage, I felt like it was missing something, so I tried out some handles, but they weren't working at all. I then had the idea of carving out some wide fluting, which gave it some lovely texture and finished it up really nicely. In the spirit of revisiting shapes, I decided to go back to that fun circular shape from day 20 today. Once I was happy with the shape of the body, I then moved on to the foot. I used my thimble as a template and then sculpted a little stalk. Making vases is a little bit of a balancing act, and once I'd cut out an opening and pinched out a little lip, I decided that the fancy foot I'd made was no longer working. So I ripped that one off and tried 3 little spindly legs, too spindly, the original foot, but upside down, no thank you, and then finally 3 little stubby legs, which just made it look like a cauldron. At this point, it was back to the drawing board, so I took a quick picture and got to sketching. It turned out all I needed was a wider base. Once I was happy with how that was looking, I finished it up with some tiny handles. And what a cutie! For day 31, I wanted to make another larger mini. I really love how practical they are, and they give you a few more options for those teeny tiny flowers. So once I'd pinched out my 2 halves, joined them together, and finished finalising the shape, I then moved on to the neck. Now for this vase, I knew I wanted to flare out the neck, so once it was attached to the body, I began to slowly pinch it out. However, it very quickly started to crack and the whole thing fell apart as the clay was just too thin. But instead of giving up on the idea, I had a cheeky little brainwave of pinching out a little dish. It's just like pinching out the 2 halves of the body, and it ended up working really well. It seems like a super obvious way of making this shape now, but when you're really familiar with one way of working, it can get difficult to see other options. This is why it's good to push ideas and push the material, because failure can sometimes lead to new ways of working. I decided to finish this guy off with some tiny little handles and a quick brush of white slip. I think this guy is great, and I'm a really big fan of this funky little silhouette. Okay, so this one was a bit of a whirlwind, so I'm just going to give you the greatest hits. So, I started this one with the idea of pinching out 4 different halves and then mixing and matching them together into 2 holes. I then mashed those together, making sure to cut out an opening between them first. I also pinched out a little lip, but then quickly changed my mind and straightened it out again. I then tried some handles to lean into the melting vase vibe, but for some reason wasn't convinced. Since I was already backtracking, I also decided that the body was rubbish, so I began carving it down to lean into the rough rock vibe instead. I really wasn't loving my work at this point, so attempted handles again, still a no from me. I then smoothed out the carving because, surprise surprise, I didn't like that look anymore. And at this point, I gave up on the shape entirely, cut off the top third, flattened the curves completely. It was now looking a little bit like a shell, so on a hunch, I decided to add some little ridges, and after all that struggle, I came up with this little weirdo. So I wanted to carry on with yesterday's ridges and refine them a little bit because they actually looked kind of cool. So once I'd formed my body, I began to add tiny clay sausages all the way around. I would make sure to wet them, and then I'd use my needle tool to blend them out. And once they were all attached, I then went in with a wet brush to really smooth things out. I then added a neck and redefined the ridges where I'd made the join. I'm actually really in love with this vase, and spoiler alert, it's going to be the best Ripley mini that I make this week, I think. It looks like a tiny little seed pod, and there's so much movement in the clay, it almost looks like ruched fabric. I also made the ridges much denser, which I think is partly why it looks so good. And speaking of looking good, if you'd like to get your hands on any of the minis I make, they will be available through my website. Just keep an eye out for updates. For this piece, I wanted to add ridges to a shape that I was very familiar with to see how that would look. I decided to make that same Bronze Age silhouette I've been making for the last 2 weeks, as I thought it might work well. I also had the idea of incorporating the handles into the ridges as one longer sausage, and this ended up working fairly well, but they also looked a little bit too skinny and twiggy, so I reckon I'll try and double them up next time. Overall, I don't really think this one worked for me. I hadn't accounted for the fact that the added bulk would swallow up the shape of the body and make it look less defined. It's still a fun one though, especially once you add some flowers. I went for a really dramatic shape on day 35 with a nice taper, a sharp shoulder and a nice skinny neck. It's your classic amphora. I then set about adding my ridges, hoping that this time the more defined shape would combat the extra clay I was adding. I also made sure to double up on my handles this time, and it really did look much better. I even extended the ridges over the foot to give it the appearance of roots and of one clean line from top to bottom. Overall, I'm not sure about this way of working. The results are definitely better the denser you make the ridges, and I feel like the only way to combat the silhouette from turning blobby is to make the sausages of clay so much smaller. It would make working on these a whole new level of fiddly and double the time it takes to make them, which would in turn mean I would have to charge more. It's a challenge that I'm definitely up for, but maybe I need a few days off first. After last week's very time-consuming pieces, I made the decision to strip things back today. I was thinking about the dish-shaped neck I made last week and how I could incorporate that into an even simpler shape. In the end, I opted for the simplest shape I could, a cylinder. Once I'd attached my dish to the body, I added a little disc to close up the bottom, and then cut out the opening. I wanted to add some fluting to this piece, but it was super humid today, which meant my clay was taking forever to dry. Eventually, I gave up waiting and gave it a quick blast with a hairdryer and got to work. And there he is! I like this one so much, I think I'm going to make a larger version. I wanted to play with some colours today, so I started off by pinching out the two halves of my body, joining them together, rolling out the neck, and attaching it. I then added a fancy little foot and some nice big handles. Then it was time to come up with a design. I like to take a quick picture on my phone and then draw over it with the markup tools. It's the fastest way for me to get my ideas out without being precious. Once I'd decided on my design, I set about brushing on a layer of white slip, followed by my little flower in black slip. I felt like it could use something else, so I went ahead and etched out a smaller flower to give it a little more depth and interest. All in all, I'm quite pleased with this one. He looks like a tiny little penguin. Today started off much like yesterday. I began with making my pinch pot body, then moving on to the neck, pinching out a little rim, and then finally adding some handles. I'd really enjoyed painting yesterday and I wanted to keep it going today. Again, I snapped a quick pic and got to sketching. This time I settled on some zigzags, which should bring some movement to the piece. I started out marking the lines with my pencil, so I had something to follow with my paintbrush, because my freehand is not the best. However, I quickly ditched the idea of painting them on, because just etching them out like this looked amazing. I really loved the results of this one. It's a great shape with lots of room for tiny bouquets or a larger stem, and the pattern is simple but effective. I'm curious to see how this etching might look if I'm a little bit lighter or looser with the work. So on day 39, I set about testing this idea. I knew I wanted a spherical body and a neck that was pinched out rather than made from a slab. I opted for a nice tapered neck, which I attached to the body with a tiny clay sausage. Once it was on, I instantly knew that I wanted to play with scalloped edges, so I set about cutting them out with my needle tool. I can already tell that the summer is gonna be my enemy. It was so hot today that my clay was drying out at breakneck speeds. It was helpful for this bit, but not so much for when I was adding my handles, which already dry out quickly and crack on cooler days. Once I was happy with my shape, I painted on a white layer of slip, which is just coloured liquid clay. Today I attempted to be much looser with my pencil, and it already looked so much better, even if it wasn't perfect. I love it. I just hope that the pattern still pops when it comes out of the kiln. On day 40, I decided to carry on looking at surface decoration. I'm really happy with the shapes that I'm currently making. They're practical and nice to look at. So now I feel like I finally have some space to think about colour and pattern. I created another 4-handled vase and gave it some nice bold stripes. I did 2 layers of slip to make them more opaque, as this slip tends to come out a little bit more translucent if you only do one thin layer. I'm a big fan of this piece and I cannot wait to see it finished. And speaking of, all of the minis that I make during this challenge will be available through my website when they're finished. Just keep an eye out for updates. I wanted to revisit the etching that I've been doing earlier this week. I want to call it sgraffito, but I'm not 100% sure if it is. Maybe let me know in the comments. I'd love to know. So once I got my handles on, I cut out an opening and pinched up a short neck straight from the body. Then I cleaned the join from the inside and painted on a layer of white slip. I wanted to go for a continuous pattern that flowed nicely and didn't need much accuracy, so I went for this loop-de-loop design. I really focused on being loose and speedy for this one, and it paid off. Look how cute it turned out. There's so much more movement to the lines. Day 42 was a little bit frustrating. I'd made a lovely little shape, added my handles, and now I needed to level out the bottom. I usually do this by tapping the piece onto the table a few times and then giving it a little twist. 9 times out of 10, this works a treat. However, today was just not my day and the bottom just would not level out. I tried it so many times that I ended up widening the base and shortening the whole piece. He's still a cutie, just shorter than I'd initially wanted. I then decided to switch things up and paint him with my black slip, and then finished him off with some little circles. I'm not sure if the double handles worked for this one. He reminds me of a little spider, but it's definitely something I'm going to play around with next week. A lot of people ask me how I make my minis, and some of them ask if I coil them. I always laugh and say that would be crazy. Well, today I decided to let loose and try out some tiny coiling. The halves of my body didn't quite match up, and I thought it would be a fun way to make up the difference in width. It wasn't nearly as fiddly as I thought it would be, but I did have to be insanely gentle so as not to squish the piece. And it did work really well, but it definitely would have been faster to just remake one of the halves. Just wouldn't have been as fun. Once the body was done, I added my pinched out neck and lots of handles. One of your lovely comments had inspired me to up my handle count. Let me know what you think of this one. I really love it. Today started off with a sketch. My daily scrolling had inspired me to look at Rococo ceramics and all of its frilly, fancy embellishments, and I thought, what better embellishment than a bow? So I pinched out a spherical body, then a tall, hollow foot, and finally an equally as long, slightly flared neck. I then trimmed down the foot and got to work gently pushing the clay until I made a cute little frill all the way around. Once I'd refined the shape with my loop tool, I then added some handles, and then onto the tricky part, the ribbon. For this, I flattened out some tiny clay sausages and worked quickly to create all of the components. I broke the bow down into 4 sections, the dangly bits, the loops, the knot, and the piece that wraps around the back. It took a little bit of brain power to make sure I added them in the correct order, and I may have totally forgotten about the back piece until I thought I was finished. But either way, I am so proud of this one. I just hope it survives the kiln. I started off today with a familiar shape with lots of space on the body. I wanted to see if yesterday's ribbon magic could work for something more complex. So for this one, I thought I would try a flower bow. By the way, let me know what you think of this one in the comments because it was an absolute nightmare to make. The first problem was the clay drying out too quickly because of how thin it was. You'd make one loop and then the clay would be dry and snap when you tried to make the other half. Or I'd wet the clay and then it would stick to the table and be totally ruined. I must admit that I wanted to make the bow much denser originally, but I eventually gave up on that idea. The next issue was that I'd decided to make the bow separately and then attach it once it was done. Turns out I shouldn't have done that, because by the time it was finished, it was too dry to shape to the body and it just stuck out awkwardly. Second time around worked a charm though, and I was able to contour the loops as I went. Not bad. Okay, I had a solid plan for this one. More handles and more ribbons. I started off by pinching out the two halves of my body and joining them together. I then pinched out a disc-shaped neck and joined that to the body. Then I trimmed it down a little bit because I felt it was a bit too big. And next I moved on to the handles, making sure that each new part is blended in well to avoid future cracks. Finally, I moved on to the tiny bow, which, as always, was fiddly and a little bit stressful, but totally worth it. I think I'm going to glaze this one white. It's giving me Nordic vibes for some reason. Or maybe the handles remind me of antlers? Either way, it's a great little vase. And if you'd like to get your hands on this one or any of the other minis I make, don't worry because they will be available through my website very soon. Just keep an eye out for updates. I felt quite ill on day 47, so decided I didn't really want to mess with ribbons today. Instead, I focused on making a nice long body with a longer neck to match and some cute little handles. I then hollowed out the bottom to make sure that my pot wasn't wobbly. I'm really enjoying the more elaborate handles from the previous few days, so I thought I'd spruce this one up with a few more. Originally I wanted to stack the handles all the way up to the top, but once I'd added this second pair, I thought the more stripped back approach looked nicer. I finished this one off with a quick coat of white slip, and then I sketched out some ideas and settled on this little doodle. I can't wait to see how it looks when it's finished. If you've been watching my videos for a while, you'll know that I love a good tulipier. These were all the rage in the 17th century for growing tulips indoors, and they're making a little bit of a comeback. I was initially going to go for 3 spouts, like the one from day 29, but I changed my mind once I'd attached the central spout. For this one, I thought having 4 smaller spouts around the edge would suit better. Once I'd attached them, I then went back to that central spout. I couldn't tell if it was too tall or the wrong shape, but something about it just wasn't working for me. I then got the idea to embellish the lip with a little frill, and it instantly solved the problem. Turns out the piece just needed a focal point. I finished this one off with some tiny spheres to bring texture to the body and to balance out the overall shape. And I absolutely love this one. It looks amazing, especially with some tiny flowers or sprigs. I decided to pare things back today with just a simple little vase. Once I'd made the body and attached the neck, I decided to add a frill to the lip. I then wanted to play around with the tiny spheres again. I tried a few different combinations, but for some reason, none of them were really filling me with joy. In the end, I opted for some varied stripes to suit the vintagey feel this vase was giving off. I'll be honest, I found it quite difficult to get going this week. I just wasn't feeling very creative. So I got my iPad out and quickly sketched through some ideas. Nothing fancy, just whatever came to mind first. And these were the 4 designs I came up with. I was originally aiming to do the spherical one today, but my hands had other ideas. Once the body was done and the shape refined, I then started working on the neck. I rolled out a tiny slab of clay and then got to work joining the ends. I then attached it to the body with some slip, which is just liquid clay, and then moved on to the foot. I had to trim down the stalk part a few times as it was always a little too long, but we got there in the end. The final part was the decoration. I snapped a quick picture and sketched out some ideas. I decided on this zigzag design, but had some trouble getting it to look good on the piece. I think I just wasn't loose enough, but he ended up looking alright. So those were the first 50 and I've got 50 more to do. Thank you so much for watching, and please make sure to check out my website where hopefully by the time you're watching this, the minis will be live and available for you to snap up. Thanks again for joining me on this journey, and I'll see you very soon. Bye!